I got to know Clarence while I was working on my book, but he's a little young. Right? The people who I was actually curious about and interviewing were a generation older than Clarence Thomas, his father's generation, and really even his grandfather's generation. And so his father and grandfather were also in Local 10. I never knew them, but they were, in a way, the folks that those were the eras I was focused on. Of course, it was an honor to get to know Clarence, because he's still doing good stuff. Yeah. But I wonder, Clarence, if you might talk a little about your father, because you talked just now about how I appreciated all your sort of talk about being a student here at SF State, yeah, but I suspect it wasn't just when you were 21 that you had already learned such, but that in fact you might have learned some things as a child from, growing up in your household, right? And so maybe just briefly talk a little about some of that.
Okay. Well, first thing is, the first time that I ever heard the name Harry Bridges, which you know who Harry Bridges is for Peter's talk. Anyone don't know who Harry Bridges was? Okay.
I don't.
Harry Bridges was one of the founders of the International Longshoremen Warehouse Union. He was an immigrant, not from the South, but from Australia. And as a young man, or as I should say as a youth, he had read books by people like Jack London. He had also read Karl Marx. He became a seaman. And he had a chance to travel and to see how bad things were for working people who worked on ships. Came to the Bay Area in around 1919 or 1920, somewhere thereabouts. But he was the rank and file leader of the strike in 1934. I learned about him not from San Francisco State or from high school. I learned about him from my grandfather, who used to bring longshoremen home for lunch. And my grandfather, he worked in an all-white gang. And he was a Creole from Louisiana. So that was the first time that I'd ever been close to white people in a intimate setting. And they would come home to have lunch with my grandfather and grandmother. My grandmother was a gourmet cook. And so they would have leftovers, and they would sit around and talk. They would talk about Harry Bridges. They would talk about Paul Robeson. And the importance of having people who were members of the ILWU as family members was extraordinary for me. I was able to grow up with health care, for an example. And the health care that I had was quite controversial, because in the early 1950s, when Kaiser Foundation hospitalization started, the doctors who were part of that plan were called socialists. They say there was communism having a medical plan like that. It was a revolutionary, radical notion. All I know is that if I got sick, I could go to the doctor. My parents didn't have to decide what bills to pay. The other thing that was important about that is that my maternal and maternal grandfathers, along with my dad, in the late 1950s, they brought me along with them to see the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King at the old Oakland Auditorium. I think it's called the Kaiser Center now. And while I cannot remember all of the particulars of what Dr. King said, I can remember the excitement, and I can remember being in a place where there were a lot of black folks. And I always thought to myself in later years how important that was, because as Peter mentioned, Dr. King became an honorary member of ILWU Local 10 in 1967. That was just maybe 6 or 7 months before his assassination. He was in town for the purpose of having a fundraiser event at the Oakland Coliseum with luminaries such as Joan Baez, Harold Belafonte, and others to raise money. But he could not resist staying away from Local 10, because Local 10 had been very supportive of him in terms of making contributions to the civil rights movement. And while I was not there at the meeting where Dr. King was sworn in, I have read articles in our newspaper, and Dr. King talked about the similarities of struggle between the civil rights movement and what he referred to as the Negro freedom movement. And he also called workers' attention to the idea of the sit-ins came from demonstrations by workers, auto workers at the Flint plant during the 1930s. Dr. King was very pragmatic, very well read. And I just wanted to say that that experience of being with my grandfather and my paternal, and all the three longshoremen, or two longshoremen, having those kinds of experiences were very, very important to me as an African-American youngster growing up.
I know Clarence well. I can ask him questions anytime, right? So, you know, if anyone else wants to ask questions, this is a great opportunity, well, to do so. Yeah.
I see my wife's hand. I shouldn't have said my wife, but Dolores.
Would you spend a little time discussing the Third World Liberation?
Oh, thank you. The Third World Liberation Front. TWLF. Wow. That was a coalition of various, what we then call minority groups on campus, specifically Asian students, Filipino students, Mexican-American students, Native American Indian students. The idea for that was this. The Black Student Union, while it was a nationalist organization, I would say that it was a revolutionary nationalist organization. They believed in nationalism, but they also understood the importance of embracing other people of color on campus. Because not only did we want greater representation for us, we wanted greater representation for Mexican students and for other students. And we made it very clear to the administration that their pool of students coming in should not come out of ours. We understood that. So they couldn't play this game of, well, you're going to have to cut up a small pie. No, you got to expand the pie. And we realized the importance of developing, because we had relationships with people like Roger Alvarado, who was very instrumental in that tutorial program that I referred to earlier, Mason Wong, and others who were classmates of ours, who we understood the importance of including them in as well. The BSU played a very important role in organizing that Third World Liberation Front. It was very, very critical to the strike, and it was also very important in terms of demonstrating people of color having a united front. Very effective, and that was duplicated all across the country. But I can tell you right now, that name, that really did stir up some trouble, because the whole idea of when you talk about Third World Liberation Front, we got that idea from Liberation Front from other countries. So when we adopted that name, yeah, they understood what we were. When I say they, I'm talking about the state, the city. And, you know, I don't know if Peter talked about how, he probably did, during the strike of 1934, the city of San Francisco said that the strike was a Bolshevik plot. It was something that the Russians were behind because of the radical notions of workers being able to control the jobs and not have to go through the shape up. If you ever watch the movie On the Waterfront with Marlon Brando, there's a famous scene when the bosses are picking and choosing, and what they basically do are pitting one worker against the other. That ended with longshoremen being able to control the jobs. Also, the idea of having the low man out system, where when longshoremen get jobs, the person who worked last, who did not get a job, is the first one who gets the job the next day. The low man out system. That's the form of socialism. My mother loves it. Listen, my mother has the same benefits that I have. My father's gone. She's the spouse of a retired longshoreman. She goes to Kaiser Hospital. She doesn't pay a thing, no matter what the medication costs. That's why we believe in Medicare for all. We just don't want it for the longshoremen. We want it for everybody.
Sure, there's some other. Please, yeah.
Hi. So my name is Alex. By the way, I'm also in the labor movement. I work at the California Labor Fed, also grad student, currently studying race, class, and labor.
Oh.
Yes, also going to interview Peter Cole after this.
Good.
But I have a question for you. How do you think the labor movement can be more proactive in race-based activism?
Very good point. Let me draw from our own.
So the question is, how can the labor movement be more sort of race forward in terms of promoting activism to sort of fight against racism within beyond the labor movement, I assume?
Yeah.
Okay. First thing is, you're going to have progressive leadership of the unions. And I want to draw a little bit from my own history. During the great 1934 strike, there weren't that many longshoremen, black longshoremen working, but there weren't a lot of black people in the Bay Area, first of all. But secondly, there weren't a lot of blacks in the union, and then many of the blacks that were working as longshoremen, you know how they got in? They got in is by being scabs, crossing the picket line, and the employer kept a few of them on.
Back in 1919.
Yes. Now, here's the thing. We had leftists who were in control of local 10, leadership of local 10. They might have been Marxist-Leninists, some of them might have been anarchists, some of them might have been IWW, various influences, but they were progressive, and they understood the relationship between race and class. There was a big struggle on the waterfront. We were winning, but yet not winning really big yet. And one of the problems was black people were going crossing that picket line. And you got to understand, when you don't work, and you don't have any real loyalty and connection to the union, because the union doesn't have any loyalty and connection to you, you cross the picket line. And you pay the consequences. You want to say
and if
something?
I may say also, many unions that were dominated by white people were excluded blacks, right? Like blacks had no reason to be loyal to a union or a picket because they had been denied admission, right? Like, so it's easy to cross a line if you've already been crossed before, right?
I'm going to get to the point right now. Harry Bridges and others knew that they had to approach the community in a very fundamental and respectful way and ask them about supporting the strike. But they just couldn't go hand in hand. They had to say, hey, we've got a new deal for you. If you support the strike, we will make sure that you get jobs on this waterfront. They did something very revolutionary. They approached the black churches. Even Ron Dellum's uncle, Ron Dellum being the former mayor of Oakland, former congressman who introduced legislation for sanctions against South Africa. His dad was a longshoreman as well, but the point is his uncle was C.L. Dellums, who was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. First black union to be acknowledged by the FLCIO. And the black community listened to what Bridges had to say. And they took a risk that paid off because Local 10 is the only predominantly African-American local on the entire West Coast. We're very proud of that history. So, sister, to answer your question, the unions have got to or get off the pot. They have to realize that blacks and people of color are more likely to join a union and less likely to leave one. And it starts, I think, with caucuses within your local. Like, for example, you know, I talked about the issue concerning Black Lives Matter, the $15 an hour. That was, you know, we shut down the port a couple of years ago around that issue on International Workers' Day, calling attention to that. And so many people in the United States think that May Day is a communist holiday, and they don't understand the struggle for the 8-hour workday in the country. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it's going to take some work, but they have to be called out. For an example, a lot of unions were silent on the question of the $15 an hour. But they got to be called out on that. Because even some of their own family members, I'm talking about the white members, they need to, because they got friends and family who work at these fast food. We have to begin to break the barriers between black and white workers. And I'm going to conclude with this. When we look back on Trump actions towards the government shutdown, if we go back to that and just remember some of the things that were said, I believe it was like the airline workers, they were calling for a general strike. They came to the realization that they were not some imaginary middle class, they're working class. Even if you make $150,000 or $200,000, if you have to get up and go to work for it every day, you're a worker. And you share the same kinds of challenges as the worker who makes $30,000. Do you remember those scenes where we saw people who were federal contractors driving up in their BMW SUVs, getting out, getting free food, standing in line with African Americans who might have made far less? We're all in this together. And we have to break through all the divisions, be it white skin privilege, sexual orientation, sexual preferences, religion, and remember, we're in the majority. But when they have us all divided, so we have to have some real tough discussions, okay, about where we're going. Because in so many instances, when a lot of the white working class, not all, but some, see themselves as being middle class. What does that really mean today? I know two longshoremen, theoretically, I know two longshoremen making $150,000 a year, together $300,000. They can't afford to buy a home in San Francisco. Are they middle class? Yeah, they are. But they can't afford to buy a home in San Francisco. That tells us something, okay? So we got some challenges. But I want to tell you, sister, because I've been a member of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, okay? And I've had discussions with our own members. And I'm going to close with this. Before black people were on the waterfront, I remind my white brothers and sisters of this. Before blacks were on the waterfront, there was still discrimination. And whites look at me like, huh? Yeah, because it was white ethnics that were battling out. And this was who was on the waterfront. Irish, Italians, people from the Polish, Slavs, Portuguese, Germans, okay? And there was a pecking order depending on where you were. If you were in New York City, it was the Irish. They controlled the waterfront in New York. And there was some pitched battles because one time black people controlled the waterfront because, you know, we came off the slave ships, and so the first black organized workers in the country were longshore workers in the South. Point is, we have to begin to take on those challenges and cannot be afraid of it. Because if we don't, we're going in the wrong direction. And see, Trump was able to play on that during the last election. But many of the white working, and listen, a lot of white working class folks who voted for Trump, voted for Obama, 2 terms. Looking for an alternative. We have to give them one. All right.